Oh, cards, how I love to suffer you. Seldomly, I think of things other than thee. Things that now I seldom do. Because you are everything. Aside the blood inside my veins, inside the highs you hide my pain. Each shuffle lets me glimpse the past, but things will never be the same. Oh, lovely, hateful cards. How I love to suffer you. Balatro is a wonderful game. Possibly the simplest gameplay loop I've ever seen be a genuine Game of the Year contender, but something strikes me as odd whenever I see this game mentioned on YouTube or anywhere else, the use of a particular word over and over. Addictive. See, I like this game a lot. I love making builds, collecting jokers, shooting for new all-time highs, completing decks, difficulties, whatever, but I also pretty much only play a maximum of 3 runs at a time when I play it usually. When I'm not playing it, it doesn't really cross my mind. It's just a time passer of a game, generally. When I was younger, I used to live really close to a casino, so when I hit the age, I'd go up there and scam drinks off of waitresses who didn't card. I'd game too, but the few times I did win some money, I just took it and left. Granted, I knew that casinos at their core are a massive scam and that if they weren't, they literally couldn't exist, but I don't think I'm unique in knowing that either. I'd be willing to bet at least 80% of the people taking out a second mortgage to sit at the craps table probably know that too. Same way people looking for a usable vein know that the substance clouding their head has no positive effects for them long term, but they're looking for that vein all the same. One day, as I was walking past the blackjack table, I saw a guy lose big. Bigger than I've ever seen a person lose at a regular casino table. I don't really play card-based games enough to know what all those chips were worth, but I do know it was all the chips he had. I couldn't help but watch. He had no expression. A void sat behind his eyes. He didn't blink. The dealer was talking to him, asking if he wanted to play again or something to that effect. He didn't respond, just kept that same consuming look. I felt like I was watching his spirit implode, leaving this husk behind. Eventually, the dealer said he needed to either play or leave the table. The man stood up and walked directly from the table out of the casino. Another man sat down, and another hand was dealt. I didn't go back after that night, but I've seen that look since. This game is so light and colorful and fun, throwing out poker hands against a tally you're trying to meet. It's hard to imagine this sharing a connection with something as monstrous as addiction can be. It's just as light as a night out with friends, or the validation of a like, or a puff off a joint with a little something extra sprinkled in. Balatro is just a game. While there are a broad variety of games right now that are predatorily making money off of people with addictive tendencies, Counter-Strike, Balatro is not one of them. There are no real money tie-ins, despite the fact that the developer absolutely could have gone this route with a competitive spin on the same gameplay loop. It is, more so than almost any game I have played in recent memory, just a game. But addiction isn't about the fixation. It's about the fixator. Growing up, I heard the term addictive personality a lot, and it's still tossed around frequently, but not at quite the same rate. I heard that term a lot because it was frequently ascribed to my brother, technically my half-brother, but that distinction has never really meant a lot to me. My brother and I weren't ever exceptionally close outside of a few years when I was really little and he was saddled with watching me as a lot of older siblings are. He was 10 years older than me, so the gap has always been wide. I was always worlds away from where he was at from a developmental standpoint, but he still played with me, still showed me video games that he loved, and still made an effort to be part of my life, even though I was his lame baby brother. My dad was my brother's stepdad. My brother is half black, so that distinction was really obvious in our family unit. Outside of appearances, my dad was never particularly supportive of my brother. He was really hard on him. Inordinately so, given that he was just a young man making the mistakes common of young men his age. My dad never fully accepted my brother as his son. He always tried to make him out as a bad seed, and this was eventually the primary wedge that drove him and my mother apart. They weren't a particularly good couple anyway. Like a lot of couples of that era and the current one, based on the rise in divorces after the recent election, they disagreed on fundamental beliefs that make it very difficult to respect another person's viewpoint once you know how they feel about certain things. Love can't fix everything. Another man sits at the table. Another hand is dealt. I was the golden boy, which to a hyper-fixating, overprotective helicopter parent, this isn't exactly a good thing, but it was a damn sight better than the dismissive, borderline Harry Potter living with the Dursleys treatment that my brother got from my dad. My mom always stuck up for him, but that can only mean so much. The absence of a loving parent on either side of the equation can catalyze terrible thought patterns. My brother is a kind-hearted person. He gives when he doesn't really have anything to be giving. He's a lot like my mom in that way, but he didn't have any good examples of what it meant to be a man, and as soon as he came of age, he gravitated to what he'd internalized as the best example of masculinity he was exposed to, the military. He signed with the Navy, expected to be something along the lines of a medical technician or a hospital medic. But he was always very physically gifted, and once they noticed that, he was given the position of Navy corpsman, attached to a SEAL unit, and sent to the heart of the War on Terror at 19 years old. The balance between RNG and strategic gameplay is a fundamental tightrope with the gameplay loop of a lot of games. There's a limit to how much random bullshit a lot of people will tolerate in their gaming experience. Balatro is about stacking the odds in your favor between the Joker effects and the various other boons you get throughout your run. I think that's one of the core fun elements of this game is the fact that you're getting to rig the system in your favor, shortening the number of cards needed for a straight, making the two pair worth absurd amounts of points, stuff that would get you escorted out by your resident intimidation expert if you tried them out at a real casino. Life is full of RNG, full of dice rolls. It's kind of more like Dungeons and Dragons than poker. You're constantly doing skill checks and rolling on the encounter table to see if life is going to screw you today. You crit failed your passive survival check. Someone's looking at their phone while going through the opposite. Joining the military always seemed like a terrifying dice roll, leaving your fate to the house. You may work a desk job. You might be a mechanic. You might be blown to bits or set on fire, or you might be a medic for people burnt beyond recognition who are begging for death. Regardless, the house always wins. My brother did not roll well. When he came home, he was an entirely different person. He was much more outwardly confident and extroverted. He was always a shy and soft-spoken person before leaving. He'd also picked up a fondness for drink and performance-enhancing drugs, the latter an unspoken normality not often brought up in relation to combat service. He was also deeply scarred in ways that he'd do any stimulating activity, consume any substance to get away from. Another hand is dealt. Win. Another hand is dealt. Bust. For a while, he was quite successful, from the outside looking in. He got a job in project management for medical technologies, working alongside people who were innovators in the field, but like many people in the high-level management and sales sphere, he was partying heavily. Those habits of drinking and steroid usage were quickly morphing into habits of doing whatever illicit substances were readily available in the circles he ran with. And those circles had quite a bit available to them. Another hand is dealt. Bust. These habits began to pile up. He lost his job. There were others after, but he lost those too. Bust. He went to jail several times. Bust. At some point, shortly before I came home for the summer during my freshman year in college, He ended up having to come live at the house as well. Bust. This was many years ago at this point. To say things have continued to spiral since then would be the understatement of the century, but we'll leave it at that. I'm sure you've all heard stories like these. I've only really been addicted to something once in my life from a physical standpoint. And it wasn't really so much addiction as it was I really, really liked the feeling I got from a substance, and I didn't realize there were side effects and that it was addictive. The substance was kratom, for reference. I just, bought it at a smoke shop and didn't really know what it was. But once the side effects hit and I realized it was from that substance, I just stopped getting it. A lot of people would say this indicates I don't have an addictive personality, but I mostly just had other focuses. Making music or working on new projects or spending time with friends playing games. I didn't have time to deal with the side effects. The benefit didn't outweigh the risk. For this reason, I've never really understood addiction. If something didn't meet the criteria of my cost-benefit analysis, I just stopped doing it. For that reason, it was really hard for me to understand what was happening when I watched my brother seemingly destroy his own life and everything of value in it over something that only seemed to bring negative outcomes. When I saw everyone discussing how addictive this game was, I was again hit with a kind of lack of understanding. But I wanted to understand. So I kept playing. I racked up a pretty sizable amount of hours in this game. I think the only game in my library I've played more is The Witcher 3. I did challenge runs, cleared most of the difficulties in decks, but I never had a hard time putting it down. I never thought about it when I turned it off, outside of making this video, of course. My wife would walk in, and I'd talk to her and forget what I was doing. I'd go back to my music or some data science stuff for what I'm studying right now. My dogs would walk in, and I'd play with them. Basically, anything I care about would happen, and it would take precedence with no issue. And after a while, I realized that was the answer. There have been many times where I've wondered why he can or won't put these drugs down, leave these friends that continue to lead in this way in the dust, start over. But I don't understand where he's coming from. And I know that I can't because I didn't live his life. Despite all the guilt, I know in my gut that's why I've never been able to be much help to him. There is something that I have grown to understand between reading the latest research on the subject and experiencing traumas of my own that dwarf in comparison to his. I don't think my brother has an addictive personality. I'm not sure anyone does, really. He has demons that he's running from, and they're much, much faster than mine. Because things like this tend to run in a family, there's been a lot of attribution with addiction to genetics. Same with the obesity epidemic. With obesity, while there may be certain predispositions to thyroid conditions or other metabolic disorders that are hereditary, a growing body of research is beginning to indicate that what's really being passed down is activity habits and dietary patterns. What do people continue to eat? What they were fed when they were younger, the foods they loved as kids. What do people tend to continue to do? There are certain genes that can cause an increased likelihood of certain addictions, but I believe what's really being passed down is connections and love, or lack thereof. We've seen firsthand over the recent years what a lack of a loving father figure can do to a person's sense of self. Not every person who experiences this becomes addicted to power and status. For these two, power was likely just the first thing that replaced the connection that they needed, and thus they continued to seek it. Most current research regarding addiction points to the same conclusion. The opposite of addiction is connection. I read the studies regarding this probably a decade ago. I remember trying to reach out as much as I could, trying to play video games with him, anything to just facilitate some degree of closeness, but try as I might, I just couldn't connect with him that deeply. Not in the way that he needs. The valley was too wide. and I don't understand. In a way, I wish that I could, but I know what that would take. I still reach out. I listen when he's willing to talk about it. But I know just as well as any how it feels to be misunderstood, and sometimes I fear I hurt just as much as I help. Another hand is dealt. Obviously, there are choices involved. I'm not here to absolve my brother and all people experiencing addiction from responsibility for their own lives. It is, however, easy to say that they're like this because they're just defective, that it's purely a result of their personality, rather than acknowledging that under different circumstances, with different traumas and a couple more bad hands, that we may be no better off. Balatro is just a game that wonderfully balanced the oh damn nature of RNG with enough deck stacking to make yourself feel like you're gaming the system until the system games you right back. Where games like Balatro offer a safe space to play with chance. In life, there's no safety net. The hands are dealt from the moment that you're born, long before you have the cognizance necessary to begin to stack the deck in your own favor. For better or worse, your parents organize a large part of the deck for you years before you were even a thought. A lot of the joy we find in games might be centric to their limits. How can we experience the feel of risk without the consequences? When the stakes are low, a rigged deck doesn't mean as much. But when the stakes are your life, it becomes harder to avoid the comparisons, harder to avoid the guilt or embitterment, depending on which side of the scale that you sit. I hope one day someone, or a group of people, who can connect with and understand my brother in the way that he needs enter his proximity. And when the hand is dealt to decide whether or not the conversation will arise and they'll be a part of his life, I hope the cards are finally in his favor.